Tulip Mania. At the height of the Dutch Golden Age, a single tulip bulb was selling for 10 times a skilled craftsman's annual salary. Not because tulips were useful, not because they were scarce in any practical sense, but because everyone believed someone else would pay more for them tomorrow. People weren't even trading the flowers themselves anymore. They were trading contracts for bulbs not yet harvested. Farmers, weavers, ordinary working people with no business being in a financial market were borrowing money to get in on it. Then in February 1637, buyers simply stopped showing up. No trigger, no announcement, just silence. Prices collapsed by over 99% in weeks, and people who had bet everything were left with nothing. It was the world's first recorded speculative bubble, and the first proof of something that would repeat itself for the next 4 centuries. That markets run on psychology just as much as they run on value. South Sea Bubble. In 1720, a British company called the South Sea Company promised investors exclusive trading rights with Spanish South America. It sounded extraordinary. There was just one problem. Spain had no intention of allowing it. Nobody seemed to care. The stock price rose 800% in months. Members of Parliament bought in. The king bought in. Ordinary people mortgaged their homes to get a piece of it. When reality finally caught up, the crash was devastating. Fortunes were wiped out across Britain, and the government nearly collapsed. Even Isaac Newton lost the equivalent of several $1 million. He reportedly said he could calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of men. What made it worse was that company insiders had been selling their shares near the peak the entire time, quietly walking away while everyone else rushed in. Mississippi Bubble. The same year the South Sea Bubble burst in Britain, France was experiencing its own version, and in many ways it was stranger. A Scottish economist named John Law had convinced the French government to let him run the national bank and issue paper money backed by land in Louisiana. The land was mostly swamp, but Law was persuasive, the French public was eager, and the scheme ballooned into one of the largest financial manias Europe had ever seen. When confidence broke, it broke completely. The resulting hyperinflation and bank runs were so severe that France developed a deep cultural distrust of paper money and banks that lasted over a century. Long after the rest of Europe had moved on, the French were still burying gold in their gardens. Credit Crisis of 1772. This one is less famous than the others, but it set a template that still applies today. The crisis that starts somewhere small and spreads everywhere fast. In June 1772, a Scottish banker named Alexander Fordyce shorted East India Company stock, lost everything, and fled to France to avoid his debts. The bank he was a partner in collapsed within days. That collapse triggered a chain reaction across British banking, which then spread to Amsterdam, the financial capital of Europe at the time. Credit froze. Businesses that had nothing to do with Fordyce or his bank suddenly couldn't borrow money. Several major trading houses went under. The crisis reached the American colonies, where it tightened credit so severely that some historians argue it was a contributing factor to the tensions that would eventually lead to revolution. One man's bad bet. One continent's problem. Panic of 1819. The United States had just come out of the War of 1812 feeling confident. Land in the West was cheap, credit was loose, and American banks had been printing money with little backing during the war. For a few years, everything seemed to be going well. Then, in 1819, the Second Bank of the United States tightened credit to bring inflation under control. It worked, but the correction was brutal. Land prices collapsed. Banks failed across the country. Unemployment rose sharply in cities. Farmers who had borrowed to buy Western land found themselves underwater. It was America's first major peacetime economic crisis, and it sparked a national debate that still hasn't fully resolved itself. How much should a central bank intervene in the economy, and who does it hurt when it does? Panic of 1837. By the 1830s, the United States was in the grip of a land speculation frenzy. Fueled by easy credit from state banks and a flood of silver from Mexico, Americans were buying up Western land at a frantic pace. President Andrew Jackson, suspicious of paper money and central banking, shut down the national bank entirely and ordered federal land to be paid for only in gold or silver. The order hit the market like a bucket of cold water. Credit collapsed almost immediately. Within months, hundreds of banks had failed, businesses had closed, and unemployment had spiked. The depression that followed lasted nearly 7 years. It was a stark lesson in how quickly confidence can evaporate, and how the cure for one economic problem can easily become the cause of the next one. Panic of 1857. By the mid-1800s, the American economy had become deeply connected to global financial markets, and in 1857, that connection proved dangerous. The failure of the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company in August of that year triggered a wave of bank runs across the United States. The Telegraph, new at the time, spread the news faster than markets could absorb it. Panic moved at the speed of wire. European markets, heavily invested in American railroads and commodities, were dragged down with it. It became one of the first truly international financial crises, a preview of just how interconnected the global economy was becoming. The crisis was sharp, but relatively short. What it revealed, though, was lasting. In a networked economy, there is no such thing as a purely local collapse. Long Depression. Most people have heard of the Great Depression. Fewer know about the one that came before it. Longer, in many ways more damaging, and still largely forgotten. In 1873, the collapse of a major American railroad financing firm triggered bank failures across the United States and Europe simultaneously. What followed wasn't a short, sharp crash, but a slow, grinding contraction that lasted nearly 2 decades. Prices fell year after year. Wages stagnated. Unemployment stayed persistently high. The Long Depression reshaped the political landscape of the Western world. It fueled the rise of labor movements, protectionist trade policies, and a deep public distrust of banks and railroads. Many of the political tensions that would define the early 20th century were seeded during these years. It ended not with a recovery so much as an exhaustion. The world simply ran out of ways to contract further. Panic of 1893. The United States entered the 1890s walking a tightrope. The government was trying to maintain gold reserves while also honoring silver-backed currency obligations, a balancing act that was becoming increasingly impossible. In 1893, the tightrope snapped. A railroad bankruptcy triggered a wave of bank failures. Over 500 banks collapsed that year alone. Unemployment reached somewhere between 17 and 19%. Thousands of businesses closed. Entire communities that had been built around railroad expansion were simply abandoned. The crisis deepened a political divide between those who wanted tight, gold-backed money and those who wanted looser silver-backed currency to relieve debtor pressure. That divide would define American politics for the rest of the decade, producing some of the most heated electoral battles in the country's history. Panic of 1907. In October 1907, a failed attempt to corner the copper market in New York set off a chain of events that nearly brought down the entire American banking system. As confidence collapsed, depositors lined up outside banks to withdraw their money. Banks, unable to meet the demand, began to fail. The crisis spread so fast that the United States Treasury didn't have the tools to stop it. What stopped it instead was a single private citizen, J.P. Morgan. The 70-year-old banker locked the most powerful financiers in New York in his library and refused to let them leave until they had agreed on a rescue plan. It worked, but only barely. The whole episode made it undeniably clear that the United States could not keep relying on one man's library to prevent financial collapse. 6 years later, the Federal Reserve was created. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to get notified when I upload again.